Bonjour à tous et à toutes. So it's a great pleasure to introduce you Dr. Anna Weinberg. I'll do it in French, don't worry.
Okay.
Let me find, I need my notes somewhere. OK. Donc, Dr. Weinberg, I said in French, but I was confused with my. Elle est professeure, donc je ne vais pas regarder mes notes parce que j'ai copié en anglais. Elle est professeure agréée au département de psychologie de l'université McGill. En fait, elle est psychologue américaine qui a choisi notre beau Montréal pour venir faire sa carrière. Donc, je vais vous dire juste quelques mots brièvement. Elle a obtenu un PhD en psychologie en 2014 à Stony Brook University. Elle est allée ensuite pour un cours postdoc à l'Université de Illinois à Chicago et elle a joint l'Université McGill en 2015. Elle est directrice du Track Lab, I like the name, pour Track Lab, to Translational Research in Affect and Cognition. Elle a une chaire du Canada en neurosciences cliniques. Son CV est impressionnant. Elle a eu plusieurs distinctions et prix. Je vais en nommer seulement que deux. Rising Star Award from the Association for Psychological Science and the Early Career Contribution to Psychology of the APA, and many others. Malgré sa jeune carrière, elle a publié plus d'une centaine d'articles scientifiques. I'll stop here. So I'll let you speak, and thanks again for being with us today.
Thank you. Thanks for that very nice introduction. Thank you all for being here too. I'm studying French right now, but I'm not quite up to scientific presentations in French, but we're working on it. So I'm here to talk about some of the research that we've been doing in my lab, in the Track Lab at McGill. We have some current and former members of the Track Lab here. Where did Simone go? Okay, there he's in the back. Also here in the audience. So some of this is going to be old news. I'll try to embarrass you whenever I can. And let me know in the back if you can't hear me, okay? Okay, so I'm going to be talking today about pathways to anhedonia. Try our attempts to explore dynamic associations between neural responses to reward, stress exposure, and the development of illness. So major depressive disorder is where we start. So we've been for a long time very interested in understanding the etiology of major depressive disorder. As you all know, it's a very substantial public health concern. So by some estimates, as many as 1 in 5 Canadians will develop major depressive disorder, or at least one episode in their lifetimes. And many of those develop very chronic and recurrent courses. So it becomes an issue early on, and then it continues to show a deteriorating course over the course of their lifetime. Not all of them, but many of them do. This suggests, this burden of illness that increases over time suggests a need to try to intervene early in the course of the disorder before things have gotten very severe. But that endeavor is hampered in some respects by the clinical and etiological heterogeneity of the disorder. So there are many ways to be depressed, and there are many pathways to depression. So it's not a simple kind of description to get there. So today, I'm going to be focusing on our work trying to identify some more specific targets with the idea that we could also identify more specific phenotypes by kind of bootstrapping our way from the brain and from self-report to more specific forms of dysfunction. And in this case, I'll be talking about neural responses to appetitive stimuli and more specifically to rewards, so monetary and social rewards largely. And we're really interested in this because deficits in neural responses to appetitive stimuli in the environment have, of course, been implicated in depression, for a long time, very early models of depression said it was a reinforcement problem, essentially, but not just depression. So we're kind of trying to target this experience of anhedonia, but obviously this has implications beyond depression as well. So why we're looking at this is because of, so I am from the States, as was mentioned, and I came up in the age of the research domain criteria, or RDoC, with a focus very much on systems that kind of cut across disorders. And one of those systems is the positive valence system, or PVS. And the PVS, kind of broadly considered, is the theoretical system underpinned by physiology that allows us to engage with positive things in the environment. So it allows us to approach things that will yield rewards. It allows us to learn from experiences that yield rewards. And it allows us to refine our behavior to kind of benefit the most from our environment. So this system is involved in processing primary rewards, of course, but not only primary rewards like chocolate. It's also involved in social affiliative behaviors and social rewards. To say politely, it's also involved in appreciating stimuli that signal the opportunities for reproduction. And then, of course, secondary rewards like money, which are actually the most frequently used class of rewards in the lab, in which we've used a lot, but we're trying to expand beyond because there's limited generalizability from that. So in most people, you know, this system functions well. People are very, very sensitive to all of these categories, but in some people or in some contexts, we see decreased sensitivity to some or all of these types of reinforcers. And when we see that clinically, we call it anhedonia. So anhedonia is defined clinically as a loss of interest or pleasure in things that were previously enjoyed or previously engaging to people. For the purposes of this talk, it's also interesting that this appears to be heritable. So it's associated with worse outcomes for people with depression when anhedonia is the primary symptom. And there is some evidence that this symptom, kind of broadly described, is subject to some genetic contributions and runs in families. It's also associated with hyporesponsivity in a brain network that's implicated in processing rewards. And this network, again, this is foreshadowing, is also very sensitive to the effects of stress exposure, which will explain some of the stuff that I'm about to talk about. So despite the kind of dire picture I was painting at the beginning of the talk about being able to predict depression, we do, of course, have some strong predictors. So we know that having had an episode of depression puts you at risk or indicates risk for a subsequent episode. So about half of the people who've ever had a major depressive episode will at some point go on to have another. We also know that having a family history of major depressive disorder puts people at heightened risk. So people with a family history of depression are at something like 3 to 5 times increased risk for depression themselves relative to the general population. But still, only about half of those people will go on to develop depression, or actually less than half. And that means at least half of people with either a personal or familial liability won't develop depression. So it's not certainly a perfect predictor of the onset of depression. Moreover, we of course know there are a lot of other factors associated with the development of depression, and stress exposure being one of the other strongest predictors. So stress exposure is robustly linked to the onset of depression. So we know that in the 6 months prior to the onset of a depressive episode, the majority of people with that episode will have endorsed or will have experienced a significant stressor within the period just before they become ill. And particularly interpersonal stress is a very strong predictor of the onset of depression, particularly for women and girls. But what is very interesting is that not only does stress play a causal role in the development of depression, but also depression can cause interpersonal stress. So Connie Hammond has done a lot of work on this topic, looking at the ways in which people who have depression or who are vulnerable to depression but have not yet developed it actually generate more interpersonal stress in their lives. And this can then put them at further risk for depression because they generate more stress, they erode their social networks, they erode social support networks, and over time, then that can put them at a greater vulnerability. So one question that we're really interested in our lab is what role might neural responses to reward play in that stress generation process as well? So not just as a vulnerability marker for depression, but might it play any kind of mechanistic role over time? So the questions I'm going to be talking about today are, first, are abnormal neural responses to reward a vulnerability marker for anhedonia? And can this biomarker tell us about risk and how risk is transmitted within families? How might this biomarker be associated with known risk factors like stress exposure? And then finally, what role might it play in the emergence of the disorder? So is it just a passive marker of risk, or does it play any kind of causal or at least mechanistic role? So in the lab, we try to do this from a lifespan developmental perspective. And we're trying to explore this through what's essentially a multi-hit model of the development of depression or anhedonia. And this kind of acknowledges that these pathways to psychopathology are complex, involve lots of interacting pieces. We typically, at the moment, until we get much more funding from CIHR, are exploring it in cross-sectional pieces, trying to put the picture together. But we're trying to look at, first, the ways in which parental psychopathology lead to or contribute to reward dysfunction. And then the ways in which stress exposure lead to reward dysfunction, and particularly stress exposure at kind of periods of neuroplasticity, so particularly at infancy and adolescence. Then we're interested also in the ways in which existing reward dysfunction that came about maybe through parental psychopathology and stress exposure would make you more vulnerable to the exposure to subsequent stress. And then finally, the extent to which reward dysfunction might be involved in generating stress for people. So primarily, we use event-related potentials, or ERPs. This is my pilot baby. It's a great reason to have children if you're thinking about it and you're doing developmental EEG research. So this will give you a sense of how long we've been running baby data, because she's about to turn 7. But so ERPs, EEG, I think many of you have a pretty good familiarity with it. So I'll go over it a little bit and, of course, stop and ask questions if you have any. So it represents scalp recorded neural activity. So each of these little sensors is an electrode that sits on the scalp and is picking up the electrical activity of the brain. Because it's electrical activity, we have excellent temporal resolution with ERPs, because what is recorded at the scalp is virtually instantaneous with the underlying brain activity. But because it represents what we're recording at any single electrode site, represents postsynaptic potentials and the activity of many, many thousands, if not millions of neurons activating simultaneously, that means our spatial resolution is less good. And we'll talk about some ways we've tried to get around that problem. But for the purposes of people who are trying to do kind of large developmental studies, benefits include the fact that they're relatively inexpensive. They're relatively well tolerated by people across development and by clinical populations, and there are very few contraindications for them. So ERPs are the activity of the brain time-locked to an event. So the event occurring here at time 0, and then the ERPs unfold in time at different locations on the scalp. I'm old school. Sorry, everybody. I plot positive down just because of a perversion of the field. That's how we do it. But when I'm talking about a positivity, you'll see me pointing down, and that's annoying, and I apologize. So there are several, of course, ERPs that are capture or that measure neural responses to positive things in the environment. The one I'm going to be talking about today is the reward positivity, or RUP. So when we're measuring the RUP in the lab, the 2 types of rewards I'm going to be talking about today are neural responses to monetary rewards that are obtained through this very basic guessing task, where people guess which door hides a prize, and then they get feedback and they win or lose money. And then neural responses to social rewards that we get through our island getaway task, where people are told, you're interacting with a series of peers, and you're going to get approving feedback from them or rejecting feedback from them as you give them approving and rejecting feedback. I'll talk a little bit more about this task later on. So with a RUP, then what we see is a positivity that is more positive to rewards, about 250 milliseconds to 350 milliseconds following the onset of feedback indicating that you won money or that you got social approval. And it's this positivity to rewards relative to less positive response to losses or to rejection. It has, and I'm sorry, this is the difference between those two, also plotted as a positivity. It has this very characteristic central scalp distribution, so centered around FCZ or CZ. And the magnitude of the RUP in several studies that have looked at not simultaneous EEG and fMRI, but in the same participants, suggest that the magnitude of the RUP is also associated with activity in the ventral striatum and the anterior cingulate cortex and the medial prefrontal cortex. So, okay. In terms of whether it is a viable risk marker, of course, first we want to know, is it ever observed in people with depression? So there's a bunch of data suggesting that it is blunted in clinical samples with current depression. And there's some data suggesting that this is specific to people with depression who have anhedonia or impaired mood reactivity. So the people who say, if something good happens to me, no, I don't react at all. I still don't feel any better. In work I did in postdoc, we showed that it's also blunted in remitted depression. So people who are currently euthymic, but did have depression in the past, but more specifically to people with remitted melancholic depression. So depression, a type of depression characterized very strongly by anhedonia and not just negative affectivity or sad mood. And was not related to other specifiers. Also in my postdoc, we were looking at the extent to which this neural response is familial. So we find that in adult siblings, it is familial. So if I have a larger RUP, my brother also has a larger RUP. And you could actually predict my brother's positive affectivity from my RUP. And that was specific, again, to positive affectivity, not negative affectivity. But this was adult siblings, and there's lots and lots of reasons, of course, that adult siblings are going to look similar to one another, even in their brain function. And most people are really interested in questions of intergenerational transmission. So if you're going to get people early before they become ill, you typically want to look when they're children. So in the first study that I'm going to talk about, we looked at remitted depressed moms who are vulnerable to a second episode, even though they're currently euthymic, and their never depressed adolescent daughters. So here we're looking at neural responses to social reward from the island getaway. And we had 85 mothers with or without remitted depression, and then their never depressed adolescent daughters. The first author here is my student, Clara Freeman, who's just gone on internship. She's great. So the first thing that we see is in the low risk mothers, so mothers who had never had an episode of depression. And by the way, these data were scored, the RUP was scored using temporospatial principal components analysis, which I'm happy to talk about if we want to. But that's why the waveform looks a little different. But you have this positivity to acceptance relative to rejection. I honestly wasn't sure we would get this in adult women in this game, but we do have a clear reward positivity here. And you see that enhanced here over kind of frontocentral scalps locations as well. In the moms with a history of depression, even though this group and the group I'm about to show you don't look different currently in symptom presentation, we actually see a flip. So it's not significant, this group contrast, and we can talk about why that might be. But now we see a larger RUP for rejection than for acceptance, which is a little puzzling. And you can see that reflected here too in the total blue, the sheet of blue. But when we look at their never depressed adolescent daughters, and that's how you can see the difference. When we look at their never depressed adolescent daughters, again, when we look at the low risk daughters, so the daughters have a larger RUP to social feedback than the moms do. And the low risk daughters, so the daughters of moms who've never had depression, they're showing this increased RUP to acceptance relative to rejection. And the high risk daughters now you see that's really absent, even though they're not showing significant symptoms of depression at this point. And you again, what is interesting is you again not only see this extreme reduction in the neural response, you're also seeing the flip. So there's now, if there's any response, there's a larger repeat or rejection than there is to acceptance. And this effect was a significant effect. So we're seeing that these higher risk daughters who are not currently symptomatic have a blunted rupee to social rewards, which we found interesting. But again, this is just kind of depression writ large. We were not looking more specifically at symptom profiles or specifiers of episodes. So my student Grace, who is also fantastic, they're all really good, was really interested in trying to understand whether some of this effect might be driven by the age of onset of the moms. So early onset depression, depression before the age of about 18 or 20, is particularly heritable. And there's some evidence that this early onset form of the dysfunction may be more strongly associated with reward processing impairments compared to people who have their first onset later. So to look at this, we looked at first the never depressed mothers compared to mothers with a history of depression. And now we're looking at the neural response to monetary rewards, which we also got from the mother-daughter sample. And so we don't actually see a significant difference here between never depressed moms and mothers with a history of depression overall. But when we divide this group up into early onset moms and late onset moms, then we start to see a difference. And so here we have mothers with a history of adult onset depression, so they have pretty intact reward processing. But the mothers with a history of early onset depression, you again see that that neural response is almost gone. And again, these are all remitted depressed women, not showing significant symptomatology at the time of the recording. And these two groups don't look different from one another in terms of their self-reported symptoms currently, the number of episodes, which was a little bit surprising, or the current amount of life stress they're experiencing. So this is suggestive to us. We then also looked at the daughters, and now we're working with a much smaller sample. So this is daughters of never depressed moms, their neural responses to monetary rewards, daughters of moms with a history of depression. And again, you don't really see group differences if you just look at depression overall. But again, if we look at daughters with a maternal history of adult onset depression compared to those with early onset depression, that's when we start to see the differences emerge. So here, again, not significant. This is a much smaller sample, but again, many pathways to depression. But we see this significant decrease in neural responses to rewards in these daughters with a history of early onset maternal depression. Okay. So this suggests that this rupee might be helpful in understanding risk within families and some elements of transmission of risk within families. Although again, given the differing patterns of significant results and the effect sizes, it's not explaining all the variance or even very much of the variance, let's be honest. So we wanted to look at how the rupee would be associated with known risk factors like stress exposure. So in study 2, we looked at the association with chronic interpersonal stress and the reward positivity. In studies 3 and 4, we looked at the effects of stress exposure. And in studies 5 and 6, we were trying to understand we were trying to understand stress susceptibility. And then study 7, we're going to look at potential mechanisms of stress susceptibility. Just looking at the time. Okay, I'm fine. So this is going back to the mothers from the study that I first was talking about, where Clara Freeman, I forgot her picture, we're looking at neural responses to social rewards in mothers with a history of depression. And what we're doing is plotting interpersonal stress as measured by the UCLA Life Stress Interview. So it's interpersonal stress in the past 3 months prior to the lab visit against the magnitude of the rupee. And you can see the low risk people are plotted in red and the high risk people are plotted in blue. And what we see is that there is an association between interpersonal stress and the rupee, such that people who are reporting higher levels of interpersonal stress have a blunted reward positivity over the past 3 months. But it's the same for both of the groups. So this is where we started thinking, okay, again, we have to really consider the multiple pathways to reward deficits and to depression, because just the history of depression alone was not a significant predictor. But when you add in stress, then we start to see more of an effect, so that you can explain that both having had depression and having very high levels of stress in the prior 3 months are associated with a decreased reward positivity. So we've also found this in emerging adults, so in a college sample, people who reported chronic past-year interpersonal stress had a blunted reward positivity. And if we looked in 12 to 13-year-olds, we found an association between parent-reported peer victimization that their kids experienced and a blunted reward positivity. So these cross-sectional correlational analyses just tell us that the association can exist, but we have no idea what the direction of the association is, of course. So in fact, one of our hypotheses is that the reward positivity helps guide behavior in a way that could generate more stress. So we wanted to see first, could we do an experimental study to see if you could make any kind of causal inferences about the effects of stress on reward sensitivity. So to do that, my first student, Paige Etheridge, and I did a study with now an all-male sample, and we can talk about that as well, where we were looking at the Montreal Imaging Stress Task. Has anyone done this task? Yeah, it's terrible. It's terrible to administer and it's terrible to undergo. But essentially what you have to do is you get a complicated timed math problem to solve while you're having EEG recorded. You're also shown your performance relative to the average person at your intellectual ability level, which is fake. And then even if you can solve it really quickly, and it's also ticking down and it will make a loud buzzing noise when you get it wrong, even if you can solve it in the time that you have allotted, to get to the answer, you have to toggle around this very counterintuitive circle to push in the right button. So it's hard, and it also has a very strong social evaluative element that we'll talk about. But to do this study, what we did was we had people come in and do our doors task for 5 minutes. Then they did the missed task for 8 minutes and failed horribly. It was honestly like the most stressful study to administer that any of us had ever done because we were all involved in it. And you'd see the experimenter pacing out in front of the room before they had to go in because they knew they had to go in and cause misery to some of our participants for a little while. They recovered. So they would fail miserably for 8 minutes. And then one of the experimenters would say, you know what, I'm sorry, I'm not quite sure what's going on right now. I'm just going to go get my supervisor. And the supervisor would come in and the supervisor would stand behind the person and would say, so I just want to make sure that you can see the screen. Did you have glasses or did you have any kind of corrective? No. Okay. So did you understand the instructions? When was the last time you took math? And then you would stand behind the person. Yeah. I'm nice most of the time. Then we would have the experimenter stand behind the person while they did the mist for another 7 minutes, continue to fail horribly. And then the experimenter would say, you know what, let's just give up on that and just do what you were doing before again. We'll do that some more. So we have a pre and a post of neural responses to reward. We also, we had a control condition where the mist was very easy. So we had everything else is the same, except the mist is very easy. Our experimenter or our supervisor comes in and is like, you know, I'm so sorry. I think there was maybe a problem with the computer. You're doing great. You're doing a fantastic job. Let me just fiddle with this for a second. And then they would go out and the person would, again, do this very easy mist and do the doors task again. And then we were also taking salivary cortisol throughout this study. So this is just kind of our manipulation check. Indeed, people in our stress condition found it more stressful than people in our control condition. And you can also see that cortisol differs between the two groups. So you see there's like a decrease for a while. I think that we probably did not have enough habituation time in the lab. We tried to follow guidelines, but for whatever reason, it declined a little bit in the first part of the study. Then after the mist came on, you see cortisol increasing in the stress group and continuing to decrease in the control group. Again, like a methodological aside, here we also wanted to do some time frequency analysis of our ERP data. So the ERP waveforms that we were just looking at, those represent a voltage value at each point in time, but they're summed across probably many, many, many different components. There are ways to isolate different components, but you have to kind of do some additional analyses. And it's important if you're trying to get at any specificity of kind of generators, because different populations of neurons that contribute to the same ERP might be firing at different rates or different frequencies. And you would not necessarily be able to differentiate those by just looking at the raw time domain ERP waveform. So this is just different frequencies. Time frequency analyses allow us to estimate the power of different frequency bands at each time point in the ERP waveform. So we can look at how much power there is in theta or delta in this case, which we were interested in at each time point in the waveform. So we were particularly interested for this study in looking at power in the delta frequency band. So this is about 1 to 4 hertz. And that is because in prior studies, we have found that the delta, so while theta, which is more commonly used in kind of response monitoring and performance monitoring, is kind of sensitive to binary feedback, yes or no, the delta seems to be specifically reward sensitive. So theta is enhanced to negative feedback or rejecting feedback, where delta is enhanced to positive feedback, and also kind of a more elaborative processing, broadly written, of positive feedback. And it's also been associated with depression and stress and depression risk. So what do we see after the MIST? So here's our control group. And we see, if we just look at the time domain waveforms, from DOORS 1, so pre-stressor, to DOORS 2, post-stressor, we don't see any change. So there's not at least an effective time that it may be driving whatever we're about to look at. When we look at our stress group, now we see a substantial change, but a substantial change in both conditions. So we see a reduction for both gains and losses here, so relative to the time 1 DOORS. So this is one of the reasons that we really wanted to do a time frequency decomposition. So here, if we look now at activity in the delta band in the control group, then we see, again, no change in delta power from time 1 to time 2. But in the stress group, that's when we see a substantial difference. So now in the stress group at time 2, this reward sensitive delta activity is significantly, substantially reduced. And we did not see this, for example, for a theta band activity. So one virtue of this study is the experimental control, and we can randomly assign people to conditions. But of course, it has social evaluative elements, but it's highly artificial. It's constrained in time, and we know that this is not the kind of experience, it simulates some aspects of the experiences that lead to depression. But mostly what we're looking for is chronic, uncontrollable stressors when we're talking about predicting clinical experiences of depression. So we really wanted to try to figure out how to capture the effect of real world stressors in a way that we could kind of more directly, not control, but we could measure the effects of in a clearer way. So in 2020, an opportunity presented itself. So I don't know if you're familiar with the COVID-19 pandemic. Still ongoing, of course, caused a lot of problems I feel stupid to talk about this with people, but I'm like, yeah, it messed up our lives for a long time. It was a chronic, uncontrollable stressor that actually, at least in the early part of the pandemic, did seem to be resulting in increases in depression, particularly for women and girls, or the effect was stronger for women and girls. And so we, who had a lot of our longitudinal studies disrupted or interrupted by COVID, decided to try to capitalize on this a little bit. And this was, I almost did my laser pointer at you, Laurent. This was actually an honors thesis for our own Laurent Carpentier. So do you want to get up and talk about it? Okay. So what we were doing here, and also he worked with Clara Freeman again. So what we were doing here was trying to look at this ongoing longitudinal study that we've been running since about 2016 in McGill undergraduates. So we had what we called the COVID group, who were people who had done a first visit prior to the pandemic. And then we brought them back in the fall of 2021. Yes, fall of 2021, to measure their DOORS again. So we had, at the baseline visit, which was prior to the pandemic, we had them do the DOORS task. And then between 1 and 3 years later, we had them come in and do the follow-up visit, so do the DOORS task again. So we wanted to call this our post-COVID group. Now we just call it our early COVID group, our peri-COVID group. We don't know. It's our COVID group. And then we also, because we had this longitudinal study, had a pre-COVID group who did all of the same procedures, but they had done both of their measurements prior to COVID. But again, separated by about 1 to 3 years. Okay. So this is like a quasi-experimental design, obviously. So we gave them also the pandemic stress questionnaire, the people in the COVID group, to ask them about what kinds of experiences they had had during this early kind of year and a half of the pandemic. And so the mean was 17.26, the range is 2 to 27. So this was actually not a group that experienced very, very high levels of stress exposure during the pandemic. So we're not looking at, lots of loss of family members or loss of employment. It's primarily things like work or school being disrupted due to COVID-19, people around me being more frightened than usual, social separation, and then people have been complaining a lot more, which counts. That's a stressor, I guess. So what we see in our pre-COVID group, so the people who did both their visits prior to the COVID, and our COVID group is they don't look different at baseline. So we're not seeing pre-COVID differences. At follow-up, our pre-COVID group also looks very similar. So we see a slight reduction that could be due to time, it could be due to habituation, but it's not significant, this difference between time 1 and time 2. But when we look in our COVID group, so the people who did their second visit during the pandemic, then here where we see a really substantial, again, decrement in neural responses to reward. So it's there, but it's substantially smaller than we see in any of the other 3 measurement time points. Just looking to see if I had anything else that I wanted to say. No. About this. So this always bothers me and kind of depresses me. And then people always ask, how long did this last? And unfortunately, we were not able to get these people to come back in for another visit to the lab. But I think it's a really interesting question to see how long these effects persist, because it's in some respects, things have gotten better, but certainly not every respect. So then we also wanted to know, kind of shifting away from the effects. Are you raising your hand? Yes.
Was there something else like during the experiment that maybe the stress level, like where was everybody wearing masks? Was the procedure done differently?
Yeah, so we attempted to keep everything the same between all the visits, with the exception that absolutely in this visit, participants were wearing a mask, experimenters were wearing a mask, and we did a symptom check before they came in. Was there anything else that was different? Okay. Yeah, but so there were masks for sure. But we actually didn't see that masks affected other components, or at least that alone I don't think explained them. Yeah. Okay, so shifting away now from the effect of stress on neural responses to reward, we also wanted to kind of move on to the question of whether having this blunted neural response to rewards makes you more vulnerable when you encounter subsequent stressors. So this is from the MIST study again, Page's work, and we were looking at whether the RuPi at the baseline before people had experienced the stressor predicted cortisol response in the MIST task, only in the stress condition, not in the control condition. And we see that for people with a larger neural response to rewards at the baseline, at the pre-stress task, then they had less cortisol production overall across the course of the task relative to those who had a blunted neural response to rewards at the first DORS measurement. So the pre-stressor neural response to reward is predicting cortisol response during the stressor. So it's a main effect. We don't see trajectories look different. Everyone shows increases across the course of the task. We just see a main effect of where these people have higher cortisol production across the task than these people do. It was not analyzed with a median split either.
Are they different at baseline?
No. In cortisol?
Yeah.
No.
So even like pre-stressor.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you see that in the other group?
Do we see that in the other group? We didn't. That's a good question. We didn't look in the control group, like whether in the control group that predicted cortisol levels at baseline.
Right. Because it seems more to be like an association between, cord levels.
Right. So we did look for in the control group with at a pre-stressor, just cortisol level at entry to the task, and we didn't see differences. But I don't believe we looked in the control group. It's a good question. Okay, so this is this suggests that it could be associated with physiological responses to stress. But of course, that is not or depression is not reducible to these physiological stress responses. So we also wanted to look to see whether baseline RUP, so RUP prior to the pandemic, could predict symptoms during the early part of the COVID-19 pandemic. So here we had 121 undergraduate participants. And we looked first at whether the RUP at baseline was associated with depression. So in the absence of kind of this substantial chronic stressor. And we see that there's a modest and non-significant association in the direction we'd expect, but not that impressive. So then when COVID began, we sent out 8 surveys to these people. So from March to August of 2020, we stopped in August of 2020 because we were certain the pandemic would be over by then. And we were, spent a lot of time talking about how will we model these nonlinear effects. But that turned out not to be a problem. So what we were doing is trying to do the RUP prior to the pandemic, predicting symptoms of depression across this early part of the pandemic. So we're using a repeated measures design. We're not modeling a linear effect. And we adjusted here for gender, so the time between the measurement of the baseline and measurement of symptoms. And that was it. And what we find is with the social RUP now, so neural responses to social rewards and pandemic depressive symptoms, is that those with a smaller RUP prior to the pandemic are showing, smaller RUP prior to the pandemic are showing higher symptoms of depression across this early part of the pandemic. Okay. So other groups have also found something similar. So they found the RUP predicted responses to financial and family stress during the pandemic. We found that it's associated with exposure to lifetime interpersonal stress. It interacts with exposure to lifetime interpersonal stress to predict depression. We find neural responses to appetitive stimuli predict depression related to stress during midterm exams. And then another group has found similar things looking at positive interpersonal images and depression during the pandemic. So it does seem to be, it's okay. It does seem to be that these kind of neural responses to appetitive content can tell us something about who's going to be vulnerable in the face of stressors. But then another question. No, it keeps things lively. It keeps things. So what this doesn't tell us is necessarily is why. So why does this RUP make you more vulnerable when you encounter stress? So one of the things that we've been talking about, and this is my student, Elena Renaud, who's, she'll be out in the world next year too. Okay, it's hard to think about. We wanted to look at, during a real world stressor, does the reward positivity predict affect and how people respond to the things that they experience over the course of their day during a period of stress? So this is one of our kind of longitudinal studies that we've been running since 2016, where we get university students to come into the lab in the first month and a half or 2 months of their first semester at university, because this transition is a time of substantial stress for students. And then what we're targeting for looking at affect is their first midterm exam. So the 10-day period around their first midterm exam. Because actually you can tell me how it is here. At McGill, people lose their damn minds. It is wild. So there's a clear kind of at least social pressure to experience a lot of stress around the first midterm exam. We did a pre-midterm, so at this kind of in the first 2 months, we did a lab visit that involves the DOORS task. So again, monetary reward. And then we had everyone load a phone app onto their phones to do EMA. So what we did was had them answer 10 surveys a day, 8 surveys a day for 10 days for the 2 days preceding their first midterm, and then the 8 days following their first midterm. And that 8 days following is because the way that we do it at McGill is you typically have your first midterm, and then you get a bunch of other midterms right on top of it, and everyone's miserable, including the professors. It's not fun. So we had them reporting on positive and negative affect, just very quick using the PANAS 8 times a day. And then at the end of the day, they did a checklist of positive and negative events that they experienced over the course of the day. So did you get a grade on an exam that you feel good or bad about? Did someone do something nice for you or mean to you? Were you humiliated in class for some reason? It was a pretty extensive checklist, and people could just endorse events they'd experienced. And so what we find first, as we would absolutely expect, is that on days where people reported more positive events, positive affect was higher. So people's positive affect did increase when more good things happened to them, even during this period of intense stress and misery. But we also found that the RUP moderated the effects of positive events on positive affect during this period of stress. So what we see is that for those with a larger RUP at baseline, you have a positive and strong association between more positive things happening to you in the day and how positive you feel across the course of the day. So how high your positive affect is. Whereas for those with a small RUP, the slope is not significant, but it's flat, or if anything, going in the other direction. So this suggests to us that the RUP, or the processes captured by the RUP, are related to the way that are related to day-to-day affect, for example, are related to the way that we experience good things happening to us in the environment. And again, even in a time of stress, the ability to capitalize on good things happening to you is an important buffer against depression. So even when you're experiencing stress, if you can appreciate positive things and you can have this kind of intact mood reactivity, that might protect you against ultimately developing depression. So this suggests that stress can affect the RUP, and the RUP, at least in some instances, can predict how people respond to stress. But again, what about a more mechanistic role? So does the RUP in any way guide behaviors, or is it, sorry, that's too causal. Is it associated with behaviors that could affect the degree of social support that people experience? And particularly because we're really interested in stress-generating behaviors. So we want to look at these behaviors, again, because we know that the brain is associated with the environments that we select ourselves into, including the social environments. And we know that people with depression, like all people, have the agency to construct the world that they interact with to some extent, just as it's true for everyone to some extent. And there has been some really interesting work with monetary reward showing that blunted monetary reward can prospectively predict how much interpersonal stress people experience over the course of 2 years. So it may be that there is something about having this kind of profound reward insensitivity that makes interpersonal interactions more challenging, both for the person with that deficit, but also for the people that they're interacting with. So we really wanted to try to understand what those interactions might look like. So how, like what behaviors might the RUP be associated with? And we also wanted to look at, what happens when people with this blunted RUP receive social support from other people? And is that in any way related to how we move from this vulnerability to the expression of illness? So I'm just going to talk a little bit more now about the island getaway task. So this is our social reward task. And what we do, if you thought the mist was mean, you might not like this also, but we have people come in and they create a profile and they build the profile over time in the game, but they tell us their name, their age, and a little bit about themselves. And then they're told that they're playing a game with a series of 11 other co-players where they land on a desert island and they have to interact with all of these other co-players over a series of rounds. And then at each round, they vote whether they want to keep interacting with this person or kick them off the island, survivor style game. And then they get feedback about whether other people voted to keep them or kick them out too. And what's kind of important about this game is they're interacting with the same co-players, fake co-players, multiple times over many, many rounds. So they have the chance to get vengeance if they need to on people that rejected them in the previous round, or to try to cement alliances. So what they would see on each trial is someone else's profile, and then they're asked, should we keep Kelly or should we kick her out? And they choose, and they say, I want to kick that person out. And then they're led to believe that Kelly is getting that feedback simultaneously as they're getting Kelly's feedback. So it's not like a tit for tat on the same trial. So Kelly gets the feedback, and then they see Kelly's feedback for them. So Kelly either said, yes, I want to keep playing with Dorothy, or no, Dorothy should be kicked off of the island and not proceed to the big island. Then they get a chance to rate how much they like Kelly and how much they think other people would like her, which actually we've never analyzed this, if anyone wants some data. We've only looked at how much do you like Kelly. And then at the end of each round, they find out who got kicked off of that island and who's going on to the next island. And then all of our participants, they win in the end. They make it to the big island, so it's okay. But they are led to believe, and we do like a whole big song and dance to try to convince them that they're playing against other real people. And we're usually pretty effective, I think. Sometimes people get skeptical, but oftentimes people are deeply invested in the game. And so what we were really interested in here with this study was looking at how the rupee was associated with behavior towards other players in the game. So this is a sample of 255 undergraduates, a whopping 65 of them identified as male. And what we're looking at is looking at trials and behavioral trials nested both within rounds and participants, and using the rupee as a between subjects predictor. So now we're just looking at votes to accept. And what we're looking at is if someone voted to accept you on the previous round, what did you do to them on round N+1? And so this is the slope of participant vote on co-player vote of the previous round. So how likely are you to vote to accept someone who previously accepted you? And you can see first that the slope is positive at every level of the rupee, right? So people are more likely to accept people who accepted them, which is good. It means they're remembering what's going on in the game, at least. I always think I would just completely forget. But no, we see people are remembering. They're actually learning very rapidly who accepts them and who rejects them. And people get mad. But we also see that when the rupee is higher, the slope is more positive. So people with a larger rupee are developing stronger associations between what happened to them on a previous round and what they do to that person on the next round. So we see that with votes to accept. And we also see the same thing with liking on the same round. So if on this round, Kelly said, accept her, I'm more likely to say, yes, I like Kelly a lot, regardless of what happened on the previous round. And again, that slope is positive at all levels of the rupee, but it is strongest as the rupee gets larger. So again, it's not really surprising that we like people who accept us more than we like people who reject us. But the moderation by the rupee and the fact that people with a smaller rupee are adjusting their behavior and are adjusting their liking less based on the feedback that they're getting from the environment was really, really interesting to us. And we're, something that we're trying to follow up in some studies that we have funding for, but it's been challenging with COVID, honestly. But it led us to try to think about why this might be. So maybe people with a smaller rupee actually derive less value from positive interpersonal interactions. So that could make them less likely to seek out positive interpersonal interactions. It could make them less likely to reciprocate positive overtures that they receive from others if they are kind of non-reactive to it. And it could then, again, get you into this kind of downward spiral where you're not positively reinforced. So you don't seek out positive reinforcement. You don't reinforce others for good behavior. So you don't receive positive reinforcement and you kind of wind your way down. Again, of course, this certainly is a lot to infer from one little computer task, but we're trying to think of ways to do that with real world interactions as well. But again, because we've been really interested in the extent to which these neural responses reflect anything meaningful that's happening outside of the lab, whether they are related to affective experiences that people are having outside of the lab, we again went back to the kind of an EMA paradigm or protocol to look at how neural responses to social reward predicted or related to how people responded when they were stressed out and they got social support from other people. So now we're looking at 193 university students, again, targeting stress around this period of the first midterm exam with the island getaway as our pre-midterm lab visit. Again, we have the EMA phone app. And what we're looking at now is how people respond when they get social support from others. So on days when they say, yes, I got a lot of social support today, or on days when they say, no, I didn't get a lot of social support today. And we're still working on this paper, so I'm really happy for any questions or suggestions on these analyses. But what we see here is positive event count here and positive affect. So again, unsurprisingly, the more social support you receive on a day, the more positive affect you experience across the course of that day. But again, it's moderated by the RUP. So for people with a larger RUP, this slope is significantly more positive and is in fact significant. Whereas for those with the smallest RUP in our sample, the slope is not significant, and yeah, it's not significant. And these two do significantly differ from one another. So neural responses to social reward are also predicting the strength of the association between receipt of social support from close others in your environment and how much you benefit from that social support. And again, you know, we don't have data to support this, but it has led us to speculate again about what this might mean about what it's like to interact with people with this blunted neural response to social acceptance, which again, we're trying to follow up. But, you know, one possibility that anybody who has a loved one with depression or has had depression, has interacted with other people, or has tried to treat depression is that one of the challenges always is not kind of getting pulled into the mood with them, so that you provide support or you try to reassure people and they either reject it or just don't show, you know, it doesn't have any effect. And you try and you try and you try, and it's very easy to kind of get sucked into a sense of helplessness with them. So it's really common, even with therapists who are skilled in treating it, to see a withdrawal, a social withdrawal from the people who are trying to support people vulnerable or who have depression, because it is very frustrating, and because it violates kind of our rules of, you know, I do something good, you feel better, that's reinforcing for me. The person with depression is not only not experiencing social positive reinforcement, they're also not reinforcing other people for providing support. So this is, again, something I'm really, really interested in. I don't have data to show you about it, but, you know, we're trying to tackle this in a couple of different ways in the lab. Yeah. So what do these data show altogether? So they suggest that family factors are involved or are associated with the strength of neural responses to reward, but certainly are not the only factor. Stress is associated with neural responses to reward, but again, certainly not the only factor. The pre-existing reward dysfunction can predict how people respond to subsequent stress exposure, at least in some instances. And little hints may be helpful in helping us understand how people generate stress in their lives. So we're working on a number of studies in the lab, ERP, and we can do other things as well. So we're trying to do other things as well, to try to understand and explore these vulnerability stress interactions over time and across development, to really try to understand this very, very complicated trajectory from vulnerability to the ultimate development of illness, with the idea that if we can map it out a bit more completely, we might be able to identify better intervention points. So I finished early, I think. I was talking fast. You were supposed to slow me down. No, it was okay. So thank you first, of course, to the trainees, and I bolded the ones who contributed to these studies that I was talking about, to funding, and then to the massive army of undergraduates who keep the lab running. And then thank you to you for your attention.